Our conversation couldn't be more timely. Thousands of families have been displaced by recent wildfires in California, and in Puerto Rico, Texas, Florida, and the U.S. Virgin Islands, recovery efforts are continuing after a series of particularly devastating hurricanes. This morning, we will focus on the housing needs in these regions and the support HUD is providing. We will also discuss the department's efforts to strengthen the country's housing market and build resilient, inclusive communities, priorities for the agency, as well as policy initiatives that can make housing affordable for those who need it most. A few notes of housekeeping before we get started. In addition to those of you in our studio, we are on Facebook Live. We ask that you keep your phones on silent, but we encourage you to join the conversation on social media, and you can do that by following us on Twitter @TheHillEvents, and you can comment using the hashtag #TheHillNewsmaker. So let's dive right in. I'd like to welcome on stage the 17th Secretary of the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, Ben Carson, and joining him is the Hill's Editor-in-Chief, Bob Cusack. Bob, over to you.
Thanks, Johanna. And Dr. Carson, thank you for being here. I do want to get to hurricane relief, but I do want to get first to some news of the day. And yesterday was an extraordinary day in Washington, specifically in the United States Senate. We saw Senator Flake announce his retirement at the end of this Congress as well. He was critical of the president, as was Senator Corker. Do you think this Republican fighting will hurt the president's agenda?
Well, you know, fighting in general is not a good thing when you could concentrate that effort on problem solving. And, you know, that's what I always try to emphasize. It's one of the reasons that you don't see me, you know, complaining about other people and talking about them, because to me that's a lot of wasted energy when we have such significant problems to solve.
Do you think that Corker and Flake went too far and crossed the line yesterday in their comments about the president?
I certainly would not have done that had I been them. You know, I don't know that it makes good political sense. What is it accomplishing?
Mm-hmm. Hurricane relief. Can you tell us what HUD is doing? And today you're announcing that you're cutting some red tape to help the devastated areas.
Yeah, well, you know, first of all, the people in Puerto Rico have suffered just tremendously. I mean, the island has been decimated. They have very little in the way of workable power grid, essential services, even food and water has been a challenge. Mm-hmm. And of course, housing is devastated. So we're looking at ways that we can speed the recovery along, recognizing, for instance, that some of the regulations are obtrusive. Communication, dissemination of information that had to be in place. Well, their communication systems are down, so obviously there need to be some waivers regarding that. Using some of the funding for building, particularly CDBG funding, you know, there's regulations against that. I think we can waive some of those because a lot of the buildings cannot be salvaged and will need to be rebuilt. Public comment, you know, it has to be 30 days. Well, you know, a lot of people can be dead in 30 days, so shortening that comment period to 7 days. You can use, you know, up to 15% of funding for public services. Well, it may be necessary to waive that because you may need more public services. Dissemination of food and water may actually be more essential at one time than it normally is. So, you know, we're looking at all the things that actually make sense. And I know that that sort of goes against bureaucracy, but we're getting away from that.
How long do you think, I mean, knowing of the devastation, how long do you think HUD will be involved, whether it's Houston or Florida or Puerto Rico? I mean, is this months? Is this years?
Well, HUD was involved before any of the hurricanes hit because we knew they were coming. So we had people on the ground already immediately assessing the situation of HUD-assisted families, looking at the structures, and we will be there until the conclusion, which will be years from now.
Years from now?
Yes.
Any idea how many years?
Somewhere between 1 in 100.
Okay. Some have criticized the president for caring more about the hurricanes that hit the U.S. mainland and less so Puerto Rico. Any merit to that criticism?
I think the president would be criticized no matter what he does and no matter what he says. So I don't pay a whole lot of attention to that.
You ran for president. You were a rival of the president, but then you grew close to the president as he won the election. How often do you talk to him nowadays?
Anytime it's necessary.
Do you call him or do he call you? I mean, and is it about HUD policies or could it be about anything?
Could be about anything. Absolutely.
As you know, there's an opening at HHS. Any interest in filling that post?
I'll tell you.
You are qualified for that position.
I'll tell you, we have had such success in reorienting HUD and making it work like a business and recruiting some amazing talent and setting out some goals that I think will actually get people out of poverty. I would be very reluctant to leave that right now.
What are some of those goals?
Well, traditionally the goal has been, to provide, safe, affordable housing for a large number of people. But we're expanding that goal to include developing people. Because initially, the housing that was provided, particularly public housing, was supposed to be a stepping stone to enable people to, move on and experience the American dream. Instead, we've ended up with a situation where, it becomes a prize to hold on to for the rest of your life and to hope that it can stay within your family. And I don't blame people for feeling that way because we created that situation. When I say we the government, we created that situation. So now I think it's our responsibility to create a situation that encourages people to climb the ladder of opportunity. And what we have to understand about that, many self-sufficiency programs in the past, as soon as someone starts climbing the ladder, you pull the rug out. So other people are watching and they say, well, why would I even bother to try that if I'm going to wind up, in the same situation? So we don't want to do that. We want to get people so far up the ladder, they're not even looking down to see if there's a rug there. And that means that we have to be creative in our thinking. So, that's one of the reasons, for instance, we've come up with the idea of envision centers. There's a verse in the Bible that says, without a vision, the people perish. We want to give people a vision. And a lot of times when I go into a low opportunity area and I say to one of the children, what do you want to do when you grow up? I'm met with a blank stare. And sometimes one or two traditional type things. If you're lucky, maybe 5. But there's 1,000. And envision centers are to let people know about the other 995 and what you have to do to get there and help them along the way. And also to serve as a focal point for mentorship programs. There are a lot of wonderful people in our society who would get involved in mentorship, but they don't have a good mechanism to do it. And many studies have shown that low opportunity children who are mentored have a much higher high school graduation rate than those who do not. Also serving as a nidus for childcare, because so many of the young women end up getting pregnant, and that first pregnancy, their education ends. And we want them to be able to get their GED and their associate's degree and their bachelor's and their master's and learn to be self-sufficient, but more importantly, teach that to their children. So we break the cycle. This is a cycle that's been growing for decades. And, we're just, observing it. And we have to realize that these are valuable people that we're talking about. That not just the mothers, their children are valuable people. We only have 330 million people in our country, a quarter of what China has, a quarter of what India has. We have got to concentrate on developing all of our resources. And we can't have all these people in prison, for instance. We got 5% of the world's population and 25% of the prison inmates. Can you imagine how much talent there is in those prisons?
What's the answer to that?
Well, I think the answer, and I've talked to the Attorney General, and there are a group of us who are working on this, but a lot of these young men, they go into prison with little education and little in the way of skills, and they come out of prison with little education and little in the way of skills. So what do? The same thing they were doing before. That's why we have such high recidivism rate. Well, why not, while they're there, you got a captive audience, no pun intended, and so why not give them some education and give them some skills and put them to work? Let them start building a resume. They can do that right there in prison. And that makes them much more attractive when they're coming out and they've learned a different way of life. And that can really set them on a different trajectory. That's what we have to start thinking about because they're valuable. And every single one of these young people that we can keep from going down that path of self-destruction, think about it. It's one less person you have to be afraid of or protect your family from. One less person you have to pay for in the penal or the welfare system. One more tax-paying, productive member of society who may discover the cure for cancer or a new energy source. We can't afford to throw any of our people away.
When you think of the housing crisis, and there was a recent report out, speaking of cycles, is that a lot of people lost their house in the housing crisis. So then more people now are renting. And the report found that the price of rent has gone up. So affordable housing has gone down. What is the answer to changing that trend? Is it more home ownership? Is it public-private partnerships?
Those things are helpful, but the bottom line is we have got to get a growing economy. We have got to get a place where people have more upward mobility, higher wages, so that they feel that they can afford a house. Recognize that home ownership is the primary mechanism of wealth creation in this country. The average homeowner has a net worth of over $200,000. The average renter a net worth of about $5,000. There's a 40-fold difference. It makes a huge difference. And I know that was one of the reasons that there was so much emphasis on home ownership about 10 years ago.
Right.
But it was reckless. It doesn't do any good to put someone in a house they can't afford. They lose the house, they lose their credit, they lose their future opportunities. So we have to learn from those things and make sure we reorient things in a way that's responsible.
What is the future that you see for Fannie and Freddie? There's been talk of reforms. Is there need legislative changes? Where do you see solutions or any possible changes that should be made?
Well, the GSEs have been in conservatorship for going on 10 years now. And that's way too long. And so obviously we need to be thinking about the best way to reform that. Recognizing that we also have Ginnie Mae. We have reforms that can be done with FHA. And these are all things that I think are vitally important right now. We're engaged in lots of discussions with Treasury and with various organizations, public policy organizations, economic policy organizations, on how we reformulate the whole housing finance industry. And we're very much looking forward to actually having an FHA commissioner and a Ginnie Mae president soon to help with that formulation.
Can a lot be done administratively?
A lot can be done in terms of setting the tone, creating the right atmosphere. Big problem is regulation in this arena. And one of the reasons that a lot of the lenders have become gun shy is because the regulatory environment is so complex, they can find themselves in trouble with lawsuits. And they say, look, I'm just not going to bother with that. I'll just go do something else. That, of course, is hurting the home ownership market as well, particularly for low-income individuals. So that's why we really need to put some significant concentration on those matters.
The National Flood Insurance Program, should that be changed in any way? Should Congress increase the borrowing limit?
Well, you know, what just recently happened in Houston obviously has focused a little bit more attention
Yes.
on that. And there should be more attention on it, no question about it. You know, we should be, first of all, you know, looking at ways we mitigate against these problems in the future. So we need to learn from each thing that is happening now. But the flood insurance conversation is ongoing. As you know, several senators are heavily involved in that. And we encourage that, and we'll participate with them in that. I think the other thing that needs to come out of this is we need to start rethinking how do we remediate after a flood and after a hurricane. We need to do it in a way that we protect ourselves in the future. So you look at Houston and all these buildings and all these homes, for instance, and all the drywall that has been taken out and replaced. Why are we using drywall on the first floor and in the basements of buildings? It doesn't make any sense. We need to be looking at other products that are water resistant, that work just as well, and there are such things, and we are having our people start to look at this very seriously. Why do we put the essential guts of a building on the first floor or in the basement? That makes absolutely no sense. So, you know, we need to be learning from these things and integrating them into the way that we do things. So, because we know we're going to have future disasters, but we need to protect taxpayers, you know, just as if it was our own. And if it was our own, I guarantee you we'd be saying, wait a minute, I don't want this to happen again. So we can't do that to the taxpayers.
When you got to HUD, what were some of the obstacles that you saw? Was it maybe not thinking outside the box of that idea you just raised, or and what do you think? Have you changed the mindset at HUD?
Well, you know, HUD was like most other government bureaucracies, you know, concentrating on what Rule 6.7 says. And what we really need to concentrate on is what is the goal? What are we trying to do? What should we be trying to do? And quite frankly, when I got there, you know, I recognized that there were a lot of people there who had been there for a long time, 10 years, 20, 30, 40 years, with a lot of experience. So, you know, we solicited, you know, a lot of their opinions on things, which were really good in helping us to reformulate things. And, you know, that's one of the things I hope people can understand, because when I first came, a lot of people saying, but you're a doctor, so you can't possibly know anything about housing. How can you possibly run HUD? You know, people are so stupid. But, you know, I kind of liken it to the CEO of a large medical center. Now, I guarantee the CEO of Massachusetts General or Johns Hopkins or the Mayo Clinic or, you know, Children's National, they probably don't know a lot about infectious disease or neurosurgery or anesthesia or pathology, but they have a lot of people who do know a lot about those things. And by coordinating and creating a vision and creating an atmosphere where the synergies work, they create a very successful organization.
You mentioned the economy and growing it, and as you know, that the big fall agenda item is tax reform. And you put out a statement in the summer about the need for tax reform. Do you think it's going to get done this year?
I'm extremely hopeful. As you may recall, when I was running, I talked about how we could really explode the economy in a good way. with the appropriate kinds of tax reform and regulatory reform. Because, you know, the government should be a facilitator. We should be creating the right kind of atmosphere. And for instance, obviously, if we have amongst the highest corporate taxes in the world, obviously we're going to be driving people away. So let's just put our thinking caps on and say, how do we attract them back? So obviously lowering the corporate tax rate in a very significant way and bringing that back, getting rid of the regulatory burdens that don't make sense. And I'm not one of those people who says get rid of all regulations. Some regulations are important because there are greedy people, there are unscrupulous people, and we have to protect our people. But what's happened in our society, in almost all of our agencies, is instead of replacing a regulation with a better regulation, we just stack it on top of it. So now to get from point A to point B instead of a straight line, it becomes a very complex labyrinth, which takes a lot of time and a lot of money. And you know, by you know, getting that down to a reasonable level, we will attract a tremendous amount of business. It's already starting to come back.
The Republican Party has, I think, struggled with the message on tax reform. And in the Bush tax cuts, basically, the message was everyone's going to get a tax cut. But the Republican Party has gone back and forth on whether it's going to help the wealthy. You were in a televised interview, and you said, well, listen, you know, the people who are paying the most taxes deserve a tax break. Do you think that the message should be that it's going to help everyone, and that's going to help the economy? I mean, there has to be a better message on taxes than there was on health care.
Well, I think we need to stop engaging in the class warfare stuff. You know, this is a country that has all kinds of people in it. Rich people, poor people, people in the middle. We're all in the same boat, quite frankly. And if part of the boat sinks, the rest of it's going down too. And we need to stop allowing ourselves to be divided up. You know, I know people who are not wealthy at all who are very, very happy. And I know people who are very wealthy who are very unhappy. You know, wealth has nothing to do with happiness. But, you know, fairness is something that should go across all lines. You know, that's why I love things that are proportional. You know, you make $10 billion, you pay $1 billion. You make $10, you pay $1. Everybody has skin in the game. The guy who makes a ton of money is putting a ton of money back in. It just makes so much sense. As soon as you start deviating away, then you start bringing your own biases into the situation.
How much of your team is at HUD, and are you satisfied with how the Senate has approved nominations? Yours was a little bit delayed as well.
No, I'm not satisfied with that at all. But we just deal with it. I mean, there's really no, I think, you know, there's a lot of politics that goes into this. And if we can delay this, you know, we can keep this agenda from being done. People need to realize that the agendas affect all Americans. They don't just affect Republicans or Democrats. And, you know, I'm very hopeful that the American people will be as Thomas Jefferson said they would be. He would say we would reach a point in our society where we were about to change into another system of government. And he said the people would be smart enough to recognize what they were about to lose, and they would do the right thing. And I have great confidence in the American people. They're a lot smarter than the so-called political elites think they are.
What is HUD doing on the California wildfires?
Well, that's been a big issue. You know, we've been out, assessed the situation. There's something like 6,800 homes were destroyed. And we recognize that a lot of and the average cost was over $600,000. So, you know, these are expensive homes. And a lot of them are owned by people who are elderly, who have actually paid off their mortgage. As a result of that, unfortunately, they allowed their insurance to lapse. So we have a very significant problem there.
What kind of
Obviously,
relief can they get?
well, FEMA is, as the first responder, going to be responsible for some of the relief, but obviously they can't remediate the entire thing. And we will be there, obviously, to help over the long run.
Senator Hatch and Cantwell have a new bill to expand the housing credit by 50%. Would you support that?
I think it's certainly worthy of significant discussion. And, you know, I never like to jump headlong into something without a very significant discussion. You know, which brings me to another point. You know, I think almost all the issues and problems that we have can be resolved. You know, people from the different parties, the different sides, they get in their respective corners and they shout at each other. But really, if you get down to the nitty-gritty, they're not that far apart. And if they would just be willing to sit down and have the discussion and talk about what is it you're trying to achieve, what is it that I'm trying to achieve. And you don't necessarily have to compromise your principles, but you can certainly compromise your methods when you live in a multifaceted society in which everybody has to get along.
How often, you mentioned you're talking to the Attorney General and the Treasury Department. How often are you talking to other cabinet officials to coordinate all your policies?
A lot.
A lot?
I think this cabinet probably has more cross-silo connections than any in history. And it's so easy now to just pick up the phone and call whoever, and you know, we all get along just great. I think that's going to be one of the reasons that a lot of things are going to get done.
You created a bit of a stir when you put out a statement about Roy Moore in the Alabama Senate race. It was an endorsement, but why did you put that statement out? Have you just known him a long time?
I've known him a long time, and you know, he's a man who really believes in the Judeo-Christian foundation of our country, and that's something that I strongly believe in too. And I think a lot about values, principles, character. I think those things are very, very important. And I think it's something that we really need to be talking about more. You know, we've sort of allowed political correctness to say, well, there's nothing that's really right, nothing that's really wrong, it's all relative. As you may remember, there was another great society many years ago that did the same thing, the Roman Empire. I don't think that's a good model.
Do you think the media has been fair to the Trump administration?
No.
Why?
Because no matter what he says or does, you know, they criticize. I mean, you know, look at what happened recently. You know, you're calling, you know, a Gold Star wife and, you know, trying to comfort. I mean, you wouldn't call someone to insult them. You would call someone to try to comfort them. And, you know, you say, you know, he knew what he was getting into. And, you know, that makes me admire him even more because he was willing to sacrifice for his fellow Americans. I'm sure that was the intention of the conversation, but, you know, when we're always looking to be critical of everything, how can we ever be in a position to protect ourselves in an increasingly dangerous world when we have people like, you know, Kim Jong-un developing a nuclear program and missiles, who has the ability to sell this stuff to people who are not going to be constrained by this mutual destruction. You know, you know, these are the kinds of things that we need to be concerning ourselves about. We need to be thinking about what kind of defense systems that we can build, what kinds of things we can do to preserve, you know, the peace and tranquility and the prosperity that exists in this country, instead of picking at each other all the time. It's almost like a little cartoon with all these people down there fighting, and there's a giant getting ready to squash them, and they don't even see that. I mean, it just boggles the mind that we could be that simple.
But the family was critical, so do you think there was just a miscommunication? Because as you said, the president called with an intent. Do you just think that it was taken the wrong way, or is it politics?
Well, I think that there were people who were just looking for something to complain about. I mean, if he had said, sorry, this is sure a dark day for you, they would have said, see, he's a racist. He said a dark day. I mean, it's just crazy the way we have gone. And if we just keep going back and forth, lurching from left to right, we're never going to make any forward progress. And that's what concerns me the most. A house divided against itself cannot stand. And we've got to be able to get beyond just criticizing each other all the time and creating all of this havoc in our society. We have problems that we can solve. In the housing arena, in the last 15 years, we've gone from 800,000 homeless to 550, a 47% decrease recently in homeless veterans, multiple towns and cities declaring victory over homelessness. This is something that we can solve in this country. Let's concentrate on those kinds of issues. We can do this.
Last question, you ran a very successful presidential campaign. Do you think there's any chance you could run for elective office again?
It would require something that I can't even imagine. I have
you had your fill?
have no desire whatsoever.
Well, Dr. Carson, please thank Dr. Carson. I'll hand it back to Johanna. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you to Dr. Carson and to Bob. That brings us to the end of our program this morning. On behalf of The Hill, I'd like to thank you all for joining us here, as well as those watching Facebook Live. If you missed any portion of the discussion today, you can watch us in full video on thehill.com. Thanks so much. Have a great rest of your day.